Jack's as good a storyteller as he is a painter, so I think we're going to be in for a real treat today. There's so many places we could have started in this show, but I thought, seeing as we're on this stage, sandwiched between James Baldwin and Andy Warhol, we might start with you explaining maybe what your relationship with those two icons of American culture is.
I knew both of them. Baldwin, whenever he was in New York, I always went out of my way to hear him speak. And that painting, that painting is part of a long series that I've been doing known as the Black Monolith. They are paintings that are dedicated to important Black American figures who have given a lot back to society. And he was such a man. When I came to New York and discovered his books, for me as a young Black man in America, those books helped me get through some hard times. And it also introduced me to a section of society that, frankly, I didn't know that much about. You know, issues of gender, politics, identity, of course, surfaces. So the Black Monolith is for James Baldwin. And speaking of the Black Monolith, I have to explain to you, it's a term that I've used for years now. It goes back to the late 60s. Part of the year, for the past 45 years, I've lived on the island of Crete. So I live between Greece and New York. And down on Crete, in the South Shore where my house is, there's a huge monolithic rock that the Greeks refer to as linikos hanikos. And that rock is what inspired the Black monoliths. So when I make them, the objective, I should say, is that person, that personality is in that painting. It has to be in the paint. Warhol was quite different. But of course, a lot of the same issues of identity and gender came up, even though one was white and one was Black. Quite different personalities. When I speak of Warhol, I have to be very honest. I really didn't like the man. There was something about him that always rubbed me the wrong way. And my background was quite different from Andy's in the sense that I came out of abstract expressionism. And Andy and all the people who were doing pop art at that time, they were very different. Whole set of different attitudes, whole set of different sensibilities, working with different issues. So at first it was difficult for me to even pay any attention to what they were doing. But as I grew in my thinking about art and painting, I realized that what Andy was doing, they had opened up another book that we knew nothing about. So I started paying attention. Yeah. So early on in the early 60s, whenever I had a chance, we would chat. So I've learned from both of these people. Yeah. And they both gave back. And that's what really interests me. You have two people from like different sources, different sensibilities, and they are both giving back to society in their own way. Yeah. That's pretty hip.
Definitely. Is that what you aim to do with your own work, to give back?
Absolutely. I mean, I've learned from a lot of people.
Yeah.
I was fortunate when I came to New York, I met a lot of different people. And as I explain it, I met people from both sides of the divide. Yeah. I call it the divide because racially in America, as you know, it's a huge divide. I was in a position that I took advantage of. I made it my business to reach out to everybody. And I knew why I was doing that. I was after information. I didn't give a fuck whether they were Black or white or gay or whatever. I wanted information.
And they were very willing to give it.
Absolutely. The early 1960s in New York was a time when things were much more fluid among artists. Okay, there was the abstract expressionists hated the pop artists. We used to hang out in Max's, Kansas City. I'm sure you've heard of Max's, Kansas City. And all of the painters, myself included, from the opposite school of thought, from the pop artists, we would always be at Max's when this guy would come in, always with a group of people with him. We all turned our backs at the bar. But they had their special room in the back of Max's.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, I think maybe to focus more into the works that are on show here, maybe Richard, you can tell us a little bit about the period 1979 to 89 that these works were produced in. I mean, it's interesting as well because Jack had a studio fire in 1980, and the 3 of those years weren't so productive.
Yeah, exactly. And there is a kind of hiatus in the development of the technique. So the pictures that are in here that are from 79 and 80, there's the yellow cross over there, and there are 4 DNA paintings back there, and there's Confirmation, Happy Birthday Mary over here. Those 5 are 79, that I think is 80. The rest of them are after the fire. But those ones before the fire use a combing or breaking technique. And I mean, not to go into too much detail, or Jack can if he wants, because he'll do it much better than I will. But he would have an image down on a ground, and then apply what he calls a slip, covering of white paint. All of it is acrylic, and then rake through the acrylic very quickly, which is why you see the lines. And in Mary's painting, the lines go in one direction. In the DNA paintings, they go horizontally and vertically. In the cross painting, diagonal in groups with a smaller device. And that technique releases the image which is underneath, so it becomes partially visible, and you get this sensation of seeing something through a screen or seeing something very much like an electronic image which has some kind of an interference pattern as well as the image itself. So it was because of those paintings that I wanted to title this More Dimensions Than You Know. And then, I shouldn't go on, but the paintings, the rest of the paintings use this wonderful acrylic collage technique, so they may look as if the surface is so raised, it's really like low relief. So you may think that there are objects buried in the paint, but it's all paint. And a lot of it is cast from molds that Jack would make from patterned surfaces, screening, small objects like bottle caps. So all of those shapes get incorporated into the surface. The surface gets built up with very dramatic effects. Sometimes it's scraped back, and then you get a sensation of blur. So you get sharp focus, soft focus, dark, light, a fantastic variation in sensation on these surfaces, these larger surfaces, and also the smaller ones.
And Jack, what is it that attracts you to particular shapes that then get incorporated into the painting?
That's the kind of thing I call picking my own strawberries. That goes back to early 60s. I'm speaking as early as 1960, 1961.
So when you first came to New York?
Yeah. When I was picking up objects off the street, which classifiable as found objects. Yeah. And my studio at that time had a The whole wall was covered with these found objects. I didn't have that much knowledge about aesthetics and painting. I was a student.
Yeah.
And I was collecting all of this stuff. But one day, the fellow that I was working with, an older guy, who knew a lot about philosophy and aesthetics, I went to pick one of these objects up, and he grabbed my hand. And he said to me, very sternly, "Why did you pick that one up and not that one?" And at that moment, the waha moment, as we call it, something went off. I realized that I was engaged in something. And that something that I was engaged in was the building of a personal aesthetic.
From the landscape and environment in which you were living.
Yeah, something. We have no explanation for this. Even the early surrealists, that we associate with found object, they didn't have a really explanation in terms of a logic of why they did it. But we were compelled to pick that one up and not that one. Someone else might have come along and says, "Oh no, I want that one." So it comes down to issues of personal aesthetics.
Yeah.
Over the years, what I have found out is that the picking up of these objects, it operates like a chain. You're welding something together in this long chain, right? And I maintain that that's the beginning of personal aesthetics. But that's how it started.
Yeah. And do you learn something about yourself through looking at these personal aesthetics?
Absolutely. So, something is reflected back. Something is reflected back. And I must admit, words do not describe what is being reflected back. Language tends to break down at that point. What we do know is that compulsion that I gotta pick that up. I have to have that.
Yeah.
It's almost some sort of a chemical reaction goes off with some form of inanimate object.
Yeah.
It's that kind of a thing.
So is looking at these objects some kind of self-analysis in a way?
You could say that.
Yeah.
You could say that. I guess you find a bit of yourself in that object. But I was gathering them from everywhere, all kinds of things. And I never put a limit on it. It could be from an organic source, inorganic source, made man, nature, man-made, from nature. It could be anything.
I mean, I think we're moving towards something fundamental about your work, which is, you once said, "I don't paint a painting, I make a painting."
That's very important for the audience to understand. I've made it my business over the years that the way to escape the history of painting is to stop painting. Now, what I mean by that is that I had to change the verb. To paint is a verb. So I had to change the verb to make as opposed to paint. And that gave me a lot more freedom in doing that.
Just because of the different word, or was it a different attitude towards paint?
Different attitude, it's a different action. That the verb, when we use verb, it's of action. That's what the verb serves. The verb serves action. Different from the subject, different from the object. It's one of action, always. So I had to change the action. I changed the verb.
And you also changed the tools.
Changed the tools.
You largely gave up the brush.
Gave up the brush. Had to find another way of making the painting.
Yeah. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about the other ways you found.
Well, in doing that, what happens is that you find that there are other dimensions out there. All of my schooling up to that point, I went to Cooper Union in New York City. The background of Cooper Union was one of the German Bauhaus, where the plane, I was always instructed, how was it put? The sacredness of the plane. You don't fuck with the plane, keep it flat. something sacred about it. But then I started reading a lot about science and what was happening in science, especially with Einstein.
Yeah.
And then I started associating what Einstein was talking about. I like stuff like that. When he was speaking of gravitational waves, he said that all the Newtonian aspects of it, we thought it was pretty much flat and even. Then he comes along and says, no, it's not flat. It warps. Light interacts in such a way, and the whole thing is warped.
Yeah.
It's not stable at all. It's quite chaotic, really. So that was like another big old thing, right?
Yeah.
So I knew I was on to something because in changing the tools, I was locating these other dimensions.
Yeah.
And that sent me on a totally new trajectory into something else.
I mean, I think one of the amazing things about Jack's career as a whole is there's been this constant experimentation and pushing limits. And I think what was interesting to me is that some of the early works that you were talking about, Richard, somehow anticipate people like Richter, who come along later on. And now that Jack's sort of having a moment, who's included in the show at Tate, and here, of course, do you think there's a sense in which the idea of art history is being expanded to incorporate other narratives in a way that probably should have happened some time ago?
Should have happened a long time ago. I mean, one of the things that impressed me very deeply when I started to learn about Jack's work at a much later stage than I should have learned about his work, was the connection to photography and how he had, in effect, deconstructed photography in ways that were much more sophisticated than the artists of the 80s, who were known for working with photographic imagery and converting painting practices into photographic practices. But what Jack did, and the best examples are probably the DNA paintings, he had this notion of performing an act of painting that was as fast as an act of photography. So and a lot of it was done on a very large scale. The pieces of that type that are in this exhibition are small, but you need to imagine works that are about the size of the largest ones in this exhibition that are similar to the DNA paintings or to the Mary's painting. The slip would go onto the surface, and the action of raking it, running the lines through, that could be done extremely quickly with a very large tool. So it was like a development process, like a photographic development process. But the image became physical, so there was a play. It wasn't flat and dematerialized in the way that a photographic image is. We ended up getting, through Jack's painting, a sense of photography in, I won't say 3 dimensions, but 2.5, something like that. It's a unique kind of imagery and a very strange kind of thinking, and incredibly suggestive. I mean, it says radar to me, it says television to me, all kinds of electronic stuff. And the images that Jack produced predate electronic images that look similar to them. So there is some rewriting to do.
Maybe, Jack, you can explain why the DNA paintings are called the DNA paintings.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I'm always looking for something. Look, I've had a horrible background. I was born in 1939 in Bessemer, Alabama. I was born in American apartheid. There's no other way to explain it. I have witnessed horrible things. I've had this lust, this obsession, to find some way of communicating, some way of going beyond the divide that we experience. So, living in the modern technological society, we know that the DNA is something that connects all of us. We all have it. I mean, and speaking about race, race is a political fabrication. That's all it is. It's a political fabrication built out of politics for the use of power. So once you discover that, you say to yourself, well, if it's just that, there might be a way of getting around this. Let's look for where's the common denominator. So the common denominator in the society that we live in, one of science, the common denominator is down in the DNA. Yeah. We all share it. It's the same throughout.
So do you think there's a sense in which you could see these as political paintings in the sense that you removed the politics?
That they are political, but without a doubt. From my background, what I came from, it's not possible to consider these things as not being political. I remember my black instructors in school, junior high school, elementary school, college. The teachers would say, we are educating you for something. It wasn't just education for the sake of education. There was something there which says, we're expecting something out of you, boy. That's how they would put it. So it's always been political.
Yeah.
You've always been political. Issues came up, you know. I used to hang out with Clem Greenberg a lot. I was young. I didn't know enough to refute anything that he had to say, but I listened and I learned a lot. I knew that there was something in Greenberg and his notion of formalism, Greenbergian formalism. Yeah. It's something that I didn't agree with, but you know, if you're around Greenberg, you open your mouth, you better have your act together, because he'll make you feel like a fool.
Did that happen much?
Oh, a lot of people. I've seen people, you know, with highfalutin ideas, and which I thought had pretty much strong backbone, reduced to powder puffs. He was that way, yeah. You know. And in truth, when I think about it and retrospectively, it's good that the scene has somebody like that. It's good that there's someone on the scene that you have to fight against.
And who are you fighting against now?
Probably this guy.
Does it feel that way to you, Richard?
Tonight I do.
I want to come around to one of your other influences, which is music and jazz.
Yeah.
And you used to be a musician. I believe people even paid you.
Yeah, I played tenor saxophone. Yeah.
Yeah. And you've talked about that you learned something about programming from John Coltrane, for example.
Well, from musicians generally. Like, people like to think of jazz musicians as being non-conceptual. It's another form of conception.
Yeah.
It's a form of conceptuality that's on another plane. These guys, they program themselves. But as Miles Davis used to say, when you get up on that stage, I want you to leave all that shit at home.
Yeah.
You understand what he's saying?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
That's the instruction. When you get up on that stage, I want you to leave all that shit at home.
And how easy is it to leave all the shit at home?
Well, that's not easy. That's a learned process. One has to learn to do that. One has to learn to take it in. I work with a theory, I call it the sponge theory. What I mean by that is that I become the sponge. I soak everything up. Soak it all up. But when I'm in front of that canvas, I squeeze all the fucking water out.
But you've talked before about, today that there's maybe too much information in the world. Is there too much for you to soak up?
I think today, due to the nature of society and information, it's an information age, no doubt about that. Complexity, all of us. We have to learn with the complexity that we are confronted with today. If you don't learn to deal with the complexity that we are confronted with today, you go crazy. I say embrace it, learn to dance with it. Because it's part of who we are today as a people. And obviously, we haven't seen nothing yet. If we think this is complex, the way it's going to become even more so. But keep in mind, which I keep telling myself, even though it's complex, it's still simple. If you can understand that, that within that complexity, you deal with it on a daily basis, it's still simple. Now, I know that sounds like contradictory, right?
Yeah, but also you sound like a minimalist now.
Well, one way of thinking about all of these paintings, I think, is that, or Jack's work in general, is that he brings painting, probably sculpture as well, but he brings painting down to nothing and builds it back up again in a new way. And it's like learning about a computer by taking it apart and putting it back together again, or anything that you don't understand, or that has become conventionalized so that no one understands it because people. Jack, like so many young artists, was in his generation was involved with Bill de Kooning, and did paintings that were similar to Bill de Kooning's.
Oh yeah.
But that was an easy way to be regarded as a serious painter, by making your painting look like another serious painter, somebody who'd sort of earned the right to be a serious painter. And then Jack turned in a completely different direction in order to do something that was his own. But when he did it in a very radical way, and he's still doing it in a radical way, by building things up from virtually nothing into forms that we haven't seen before, which have their own logic. So in this room, we've got the earlier works that have that inverted photographic process, but the later ones, the acrylic collages, are really using paint in a novel way. Expanding the sense of what can be done with paint. And I always think there's a political analogy to all of this also, because if you can do it in art, you can do it in other areas of life. There ought to be some way that we can bring politics down to nothing and build it back up again.
Do you believe that too?
It's the sort of thing that gives me reasons for getting up in the morning. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I would agree with that.
And you see the work then as a kind of social project in a way?
Social?
Yeah, it's curious when you come into a room full of abstract paintings that so many of them involve people in the titles, with your work in general as well.
Yeah, well, people, hey, look. We're here today. These are people. Just want to do a DNA test on each one of them. We might find one or two aliens scattered through there somewhere. People are the catalysts When I lock on to somebody, Andy Warhol,
Yeah.
James Baldwin, this painting over here, my dear sweet cousin, Naomi Walls. The State Department sent her to Africa in the early 50s to set up medical stations and teach people about hygiene, women about birthing.
Yeah.
All right? She was an incredible woman. One of the sweetest people I have ever known. So the person, that person, people, is the catalyst. Now, going back to my early days in chemistry, I was a med student pre-med student down at Tuskegee. A catalyst is something that's either speeds up or slows down a chemical reaction. So the catalyst becomes something that I use, but it starts with the people. That's what set it off.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. But maybe you could talk a little bit more about Tuskegee, and then we'll get to the people in the room with questions. George Washington Carver was maybe an influence on you.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah. You know, going to the black schools, the black segregated schools in the South, they always had huge photographs of important black people. They had this big photograph of Dr. Carver, big photograph of Frederick Douglass, another big photograph of Du Bois. You go into the classroom, they had them on the wall. And they instructed you in who these people were. I came from a very poor family. My father was a coal miner. My mother was a seamstress. There was no money for education. I came from a background that the only option you had were the U.S. Army, the coal mine of the U.S. Steel Company. That was it. That was your option. Now, I've been doing art since I was a kid, art and music. That was my thing. But I was also good in the sciences. So I received scholarships to go to Tuskegee. Tuskegee accepted me on a work scholarship plan. I went into Tuskegee with the idea of becoming a doctor and a U.S. pilot. I was in the Air Force ROTC. It was good. I was the first in the family to go directly from high school to college. And it gave me time to think and get my own mind together. But after 2 years, I had this amazing revelation in an Air Force ROTC class one morning. Now, all of you have heard of the Tuskegee Airmen and what happened here in Europe during World War II with the Tuskegee Airmen.
You might need to explain that, I think.
Well, yeah. During the days of segregation, black guys were not allowed to go to the regular Air Force. You couldn't. They didn't allow it. So they developed a separate branch, and it started at Tuskegee Institute to train black pilots. Tuskegee has an amazing historical record. They produced the Tuskegee Airmen, who fought with bravery throughout the European campaign, all over Europe, and showed, what black people could do if given the opportunity. So to speak of the Air Force ROTC at Tuskegee was no small thing. This shit was serious. This is the type of thing where you expected to stand and everything was spit shine and so forth. Yeah. And I'm sitting in class one morning. We went to class with a full uniform on. I'm in class. And all of a sudden, I stood up out of my seat. And I mumbled underneath me, what am I doing here? I looked around me. It was as if something or someone had touched me on the shoulder, and the base colonel just went apeshit. He said, Cadet Whitten, attention, attention. And I said it again. Now, I didn't know what had happened to me. I must admit, I don't know. But I knew that I had to leave Tuskegee. My poor mother cried so much I thought I was going to kill her. The idea of her son being a doctor in the U.S. Air Force, I mean, my God, this was something that you could only dream about. But I had to do that. But those years at Tuskegee, got me off the ground. George Washington Carver was a well-known scientist who worked with peanuts.
Yeah.
There's a museum. His laboratory is still at Tuskegee. We made it into a museum. And he was a painter. He did little paintings, little landscape paintings, still lifes. His tools are still there. That stuff affected me.
Yeah.
Affected me big time. Stories like that, as I said earlier about arriving in New York, I've learned from a lot of different types of people. I've picked up information from all over. I've learned in the best possible way. Even with the jazz musicians, when I came to New York, I would practice sit at the feet of Thelonious Monk at the old 5-spot. That kind of a thing. And every chance I would get, I'm peppering with person, like going back to Coltrane. Coltrane got tired of me being in his face asking questions. But one day he said to me, don't you get it? It's like a wave. It's like a wave. And again, something went off in my brain. It was enough to satisfy something that I felt deep down. He's saying it was like a wave. Yeah. And I used that. I worked with that for years. I still do. It's a good story. It's a long history. Yeah.
Well, before you get tired of people getting in your face asking questions, maybe we can throw it open to the audience to see if anyone here has something they want to ask Jack or Richard.
Please, I was curious as to how important a perceived narrative is to you in view of the spectator when they look at your work.
Sometimes it happens immediately, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it happens afterwards. I've had some strange experience with people viewing paintings. I have a memorial painting for 9/11 as an example. It's a big painting. In feet, it's 10 feet by 20 feet. I'm one of the people who actually saw what happened to the North Tower and the South Tower. When it came time to exhibit that painting, I walked in a gallery and there was a woman there standing in front of it just crying. It was quite touching. I think in a visceral manner, it comes through.
Yeah.
But I'm not kidding myself. These are not literal narratives. They aren't. I have learned over the years, though, there's such a thing as abstract narrative. All narrative is not literal. And going back to my studies in medicine, the word osmosis? It's where a fluid can literally be transposed through membranes. Stuff can move from here to here, the organs. It operates like that, visceral. It's there. We're not even aware of it. It happens. And in truth, knowing how Madison Avenue operates with advertising, it might be the best way to get messages across. The best form of advertisement, I gather, is when you go into the store and you're picking up something and buying something, you're not even aware of it. It has already gotten into your brain. Guys on Madison Avenue, they understand this.
And this is coming from someone who used to be a sign painter at one point, right?
Oh, yeah, I did that too. Sure.
So you have some direct experience. Are there more questions?
In view of what you said about jazz and your connection to it, you know how many jazz musicians came to Europe and ended up having far more success here than they had in the States. Did you happen to have friendships with artists, transatlantic, acquaintances? You obviously knew a lot of people back in New York.
Not so much in Europe. It was years later when I started meeting European artists. Not up until, sometime in the 60s.
Yeah.
Right. But in New York, I had access to a diverse group of artists. My first studio was on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, 1960. And over there was a huge diversity of artists. By 1964, we experienced the first wave of Japanese artists coming into New York. I knew Namjoon Pak very well. You know Namjoon, right? And through Namjoon, I met quite a few European artists. Danielle Spory, who was a buddy of Namjoon's. I met Joseph Beuys through Namjoon because they worked together. Early on, I was the guy carrying all of Namjoon's stuff around from site to site. Those early TV things. Namjoon's work affected me a lot. The TV, when we speak of the Rasta image, he did those early TV things and he would manipulate them. It wasn't so much for the image, it was for the Rasta pattern. And that stuff really affected me. I was very much interested in that. Over the years, there were contact with Europeans, but not to any degree, though.
For decades and decades, African American artists in America struggled to be shown, struggled to find a home. That is certainly getting better. It's certainly expanding in the States, and your work, so many, Norm Lewis, so many other artists are now global. But there is a constant conversation that's taking place about whether or not artists that are coming up, as well as you yourself, consider yourself or should be considered as African American artists. Should it be put in a box? Should it be defined in that way? Is defining it that way putting it in a box? I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
It doesn't have to be put in a box, but it should be known that I'm African American artist. My buddy Bryce Martin is white. We don't make no big deal out of it. It's white, Warhol was white. Rauschenberg was white. de Kooning was a funny white dude. Here we enter the political sphere. It's put in a box purposely for political reasons. That I don't like. But the public should know that Jack Whitten is black. They should know his background, where he came from. And I have no problem with that. But as I have told any number of museum directors and curators, I don't want to be at no damn show and I walk in there and they got a big red, black, and green ribbon on the painting which says he's a black artist. That's crazy. That's crazy, totally unnecessary. But the public should know that Jack Whitten's a black artist. It defines who I am, each one of us, white, black. We have where we are, how we were born, where we are from, what we eat, what our interests are. There's a sensibility there. It was explained to me years and years ago, sensibility is part of the art-making process. Like this guy had an old instructor, he used to say, sensibility is like that, plasticity is like that. He would turn his hand over. Everybody's got it. The only defining line that interests me from all of these artists, like my love of Matisse, my love of Mondrian, there's a sensibility. If I'm in a classroom and I'm trying to introduce a group of students to Matisse's work, I have to tell them, the man's French. And being French, there is a distinct sensibility there. That's important. That's important. We have to make those distinctions. It's part of it, right? But I don't see the necessity of putting it into this political box. I mean, that, to me, in my thinking, that's absurd. And over the years, when anyone has ever tried to do that to me, I let them have it. I mean, I don't hesitate. Because, you know, I guess Mr. Trump is still trying to do it. You know, who needs that shit? Who needs it?
I'd really like to thank Richard and Jack for being firmly out of the box. And it's been a real pleasure to share the stage with you and hear you.
Well, perhaps there's a bigger box out there that all of us are in. You know, I read a lot of Mr. The guy who wrote The Brief History of Time.
Stephen Hawking.
Yeah, Hawking.
Yeah. And Hawking say, hey, wait a minute. You guys are making such a rush to go out there in outer space. You don't know, let's say there are people out there. You don't know what you're getting involved with. So there might be a greater box out there than we know.
Well, that's a great moment to leave things, I think. Everyone should be very careful about who they hang out with later on. But thanks so much, Jack and Rich.
Thank you.
Thank you.